The ability to loop or iterate over code is, again, one of the foundational functionalities of most programming languages, and it certainly is true in C# as well. But there are three main looping statements that you need to look at in C#. And this is while, for, and do. And the main thing you need to understand is the basic syntax on these, but what differentiates while and for from do. Now, looping statements are also called iteration statements. So if you see that term on the exam, don't let it confuse you. You're just iterating over something, and that's what they're talking about. So make sure you understand the operational differences between these statements so that you can choose the correct one on the exam. Now, the while loop's pretty straightforward. While is used to run a statement repeatedly as long as some condition is true. So, while this Boolean expression is true, we'll execute this statement and loop back up, check it again, execute the statement if it's true, and just keep going right back over this over and over and over. We just keep looping here. Now, you can have more than one statement, and you can use a block. So while the Boolean expression is true, statement 1 and 2 will execute. Now there's some things you need to remember about the while loop. Watch for this on the exam. It's going to continue to execute until that Boolean expression evaluates to false. So you want to make sure that you provide some logic to cause that expression to evaluate to false at some point. So for an example here, we've created a variable called I of data type integer, set it equal to 0. Then we're going to go through this while loop. And while I is less than 10, we want to continue to do our console write line. Then we're going to increment I by 1 so that at some point I will be not less than 10, and we can break out of our loop and continue to go. Now the for loop is really just a formal, more concise way to perform very similar functionality to a while loop. Our variable initialization, the Boolean expression, and the update control variable are part of the syntax of the statement. So it's not like it is in a while where you can forget to code this part and create an endless loop. Notice in the for loop, in the parentheses here, we first of all initialize our variable. We create a variable I, this integer data type, set it equal to 0. And then every time we loop through, I is evaluated. Is it less than 10? Is that that's our Boolean? And then we increment I by 1 every time through. Very, very clean, neat way to take care of this. And notice on both the while loop and the for loop, the Boolean is checked before the code or the body is ever run. And so if you got a false, you'll never get the code to run there. Now, another thing to remember here, the initialization and control variable is scoped to the for loop. So that I variable, once you break out of this particular for loop, is not accessible. For that reason, you could have 3 or 4 for loop statements, one after another, and they can all use the integer I in their count, because once one of those completes, I goes out of scope and it's available to be used again. In other words, it's not accessible outside the for loop. Now the do loop is a little different. The main aspect that you need to remember about the do loop is how it executes in comparison to while and for loops. The do loop evaluates the Boolean expression after each iteration. Now that means the body statement always executes at least once. So watch for this. When you need that in your code, this is why you would do a do loop as opposed to a for loop. Now, look at the syntax here. Creating an integer I, setting it equal to 0. Then we're calling our do loop. This is going to run the first time. We'll increment I, and then we will check, and this is also called a do while loop. So while I is less than 10, we'll just keep doing this. But again, notice this is always going to execute at least once. And so that's kind of the main difference between those. Now, one more thing about loop statements you need to remember. You can use the break keyword inside your statement body to exit the loop at any time. When you do that, you'll just continue code execution following right after the loop code. And the continue keyword can be used also, but be very careful with it because it generally produces code that's hard to read and it can produce some surprising results. So you may see continue on the exam, but just understand it's generally not a good idea to use that. So anyway, that's the bottom line on loops. Again, no code example here. You can go build some of these and play with them if you would like. Make sure you know the difference between when and how they execute those body statements. And again, whether they execute it before or after the Boolean is evaluated, and you should be just fine on the exam.